says you don't have bipartisanship? When it comes to spending money, Democrats and even many times Republicans and even this president are willing to spend $2 trillion on infrastructure. How are we going to pay for that? Well, we'll get to that a little bit later. And I do want to also address a couple of other issues that have been lingering out there. One of those has to do with the fact that there are a number of candidates suggesting that we should allow felons to vote. And that's one which, if actually carefully constructed, could make some sense. But, of course, it's all right now done to see if you can increase the number of Democratic voters. So we'll get into that. A couple of articles that I've posted here related to the issue of guns. Of course, we're already talking about the shooting there at UNC, but also what is happening at our border, the possibility that there was an FBI investigation that Antifa wanted to buy guns and cause a stir at the border, which also brings us a little bit later to something we'll talk about in terms of some of the turmoil at the National Rifle Association. So if you don't think we have something to talk about, you have not been paying attention, because we do have quite a bit. Let me just mention that this is Wednesday. This is oftentimes when we have our Millennial Round Table. But if you have paid attention to a few things we've already announced and even some of the graphics we've posted and some other announcements, that day, the Millennial Round Table will now move to Tuesday. The first opportunity will be next Tuesday, May 7th. There's some reasons for that, and that is the usual host of the Millennial Round Table, Nick Pitts. It makes it a lot easier for him to actually do that on a Tuesday. As a vice president at Dallas Baptist University, they have chapels oftentimes on Monday and Wednesday. They also, because of that, tend to have a lot of meetings, luncheons, and other things on those days. And so when he's oftentimes driving over here on Wednesday, he'll get a call from the president saying, "Where are you?" "Well, I'm driving to do radio." "Okay, well, I guess you can't make the meeting, or you can't help us with something we're doing at the luncheon today." And so I had a chance to talk with the president about that, and he was quite thrilled that we were going to move Nick and the Millennial Round Table to Tuesday. So that will be the plan starting on May 7th. And today, since we don't have any millennials, and since we don't have Nick, for all sorts of reasons in terms of his own travel and other activities, you have me. So let's, if we can, talk briefly about this. It's hard to sort all of this out, but again, the history is pretty simple, and that is you had the special counsel, Robert Mueller, who actually released his report. We now know from a letter that he has just posted yesterday, which I think was an attempt to try to affect, maybe even sully the testimony of the Attorney General. But anyway, we know from the letter and from other leaks that have come out that he twice pushed the Attorney General, William Barr, to release more of the investigative findings. Because originally, what you might remember is the Attorney General released a 4-page summary of what is almost 400 pages. And my argument has been, since the beginning, it makes sense to release the report, but you can't release every bit of it, because some of it should, I think, legitimately be redacted because it might be affecting an ongoing investigation, or it might tip our hand in terms of how we know certain things about Russia and others. So I still have argued, because if you look at it the other way, and just imagine if this was an investigation of a Democratic president, where then a Democratic appointed Attorney General released a 4-page letter, would anybody seriously believe that that was enough? And so, of course, there has been since then the releasing of the entire document where there are some redactions. And so this is what has really been kind of the big back and forth. After 22 months, the conclusion from the Attorney General, William Barr, is that there was no collusion. And even though there were instances that some people might look at thinking that this was obstruction of justice, there is really nothing that passed the threshold of obstruction of justice, which Robert Mueller reported, because maybe he was hoping that this would be picked up by, say, the Congress. And, of course, that's exactly where it's going. So that's been kind of the back and forth today. I, again, want to go back to my illustration. Imagine if you had a Democratic president and you had a democratically appointed Attorney General who, first of all, released a 4-page summary, and then released the entire Attorney General, released the entire special counsel report after 22 months of investigation so that people could read it virtually in its entirety. I think then if you had Republicans call the attorney general to actually explain why he redacted this or why he redacted that or why he came to that conclusion, I think at most people at this point would think that that was unbelievable overkill. And I'm hoping that the American people look at this and come to the same conclusion. But I have no guarantee that that is the case. And so we'll see where this plays itself out because of the ongoing back and forth, because there are certainly some of the Democratic leaders who would love to have some reason for calling for the impeachment of the president. That, of course, would happen in the House. And then the Senate, where the Senate panel was taking place today, would actually convene a court of some sort to evaluate that. So nevertheless, that's where we are in that case. After the break, though, I want to get into a little bit more of this shooting. It is, first of all, one that hasn't garnered as much attention as some of the shootings in the past, in part because the death toll was lower, 2 killed, 4 injured, and in part because there's been so much focus on William Barr, Robert Mueller, the investigation, as well as a variety of other things, the conflict in Caracas, Venezuela right now, and a variety of other things, that it hasn't had as much attention. And that may be a good thing, as we talk about when we come back from the break, because sometimes giving some of these shooters much media attention informs not only them, but actually encourages others to maybe do the same kind of thing. But again, former student, by the way, opened fire in a classroom at University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and killed 2 people, injured 4. And this was on the last day of classes. The police, of course, have disarmed and apprehended the suspect. And so we'll maybe learn a little bit more about motivation, but I'm sure we'll have no real justification for anything that took place. But when we come back, one of the things that Nick Pitt, since he's not here today, actually posted was a study that was done more recently, which says what we've already talked about on this program before, and that is schools actually are much safer than they were in the 1990s, even though there have been some of these reported shootings. Some of that may just be due to the fact that we have a better reporting of some of those, and as a result, need to come back and recognize that we still live in a relatively safe society. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The Attorney General, William Barr, caused quite a stir the other day when he concluded the government had been engaged in spying. The sentence that generated the outrage was this: "I believe the government spied on the Trump campaign." His statement led to another round of commentators arguing that this was merely surveillance, not spying. But in a recent article in The Hill, Kevin Brock explains that even attempting to make a semantic difference misses what was done. He should know, since he was the former Assistant Director of Intelligence for the FBI and served as an FBI Special Agent for 24 years and was the Principal Deputy Director of the National Counterterrorism Center. He explains that what was unleashed on an American citizen was without precedent. The FISA surveillance allows the clandestine microphone and camera capture of the target at all times in all places, even the most intimate of his daily life. It is more intrusive than even a Title III criminal wiretap for a drug dealer or a mob boss. There really is a major difference between spying and FISA court-ordered surveillance. He says it is the epitome of government power over an individual's privacy. It is the nuclear option in the world of intelligence collection. He also reminds us that the government only uses such an option when surveilling foreign nationals who have been spying on U.S. interest, or sometimes for U.S. citizens who hold security clearances and possess national security information that might be turned over to another country. It has never been used by an FBI director or deputy director to intercept an individual with no clearance or obvious access to sensitive information. Please remember this the next time you hear someone reject the idea that the government was spying on the Trump campaign and suggesting that it was only surveillance. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, let me spend just a little bit of time talking about the school shooting, then move on to some other issues. And if nothing else, like I said, sometimes when we have these shootings, they dominate our attention. And, of course, Stoneman Douglas High School, a good example of that, 17 killed, 14 wounded. And this piece that I have, and it was linked by the daily briefing that comes out by Nick Pitts, goes back to kind of a summary of some of the research studies, most of which have been done, at least in this regard, by a man by the name of James Allen Fox. So when I refer to Fox, he is the professor of criminology at Northeastern University, and points out that when this particular study came out after the shooting in Parkland, Florida, he said since 1996, there have been 16 multiple victim shootings in schools or incidents involving 4 or more victims and at least 2 deaths by firearms, excluding the assailant. So this one in UNC Charlotte will also be an additional one. But of these 8 are mass shootings or incidents involving 4 or more deaths, excluding the assailant. In each case, they exclude the assailant, which I think is wise to do so. But the point that they're making is that this has the shooting back in Parkland, Florida, at Stoneman Douglas High School, really launched calls for gun control, all sorts of national outrage, and the rest. We can go through all of the facts and figures, but it is fascinating to look at the documentation of this in terms of non-shooting mass murders, mass shootings, mass public shootings, and mass school shootings, using basically data from the FBI's homicide report, the Congressional Research Service, even USA Today, Gun Violence Archives, and many of the others. And their research finds that shooting incidents involving students have been declining since the 1990s. Matter of fact, the argument they make is a very clear one. 4 times the number of children were killed in schools in the early 1990s than today. So Fox concludes this is not an epidemic of school shootings. And then adds, just to put it in some kind of context at least, that kids are killed each year, many more killed each year from pool drownings, bicycle accidents. There are around 55 million school children in the United States, and on average over the past 25 years, about 10 students per year were killed by gunfire at schools. Now, again, I'm not trying to be crass about this because even one loss of life is one too many. And sometimes when you look at this, it can sound so hard-hearted when you start evaluating the number of people that were injured, the number of people that were killed in school shootings, on and on and on. And, of course, if you ask the average young person today, they are convinced that they have a high likelihood of actually being involved in a school shooting at their school before they graduate. The evidence is overwhelmingly the other way. Now, the point I make is that we don't want to minimize that, but we do want to put that in some kind of perspective. But yesterday I spent a little bit of time talking about this, but I thought I would come back and point you, if you're interested, to a commentary I did back in June. And it has to do with some of the research that Malcolm Gladwell has pulled together. Now, you remember him from a variety of different books, probably Outliers, probably the best, but there are many other things that he has written. But he has actually pulled work from a lot of different sociologists and actually argued that these school shootings and these other mass shootings, because some of them don't happen in the schools, are what he refers to and what sociologists refer to as a slow motion riot. And he also then goes on to argue that Columbine, which happened, of course, essentially 20 years ago, just had the celebration of it then, actually set what they call the cultural script of this. And so in some respects, we need to understand that they set the script, and then each particular action in some respects lowers the threshold, probably a better way to say it, from the next action. And let's go for just a minute to riots. I mentioned this yesterday, but it's worth mentioning again. If you've ever watched a riot, and I've seen some face-to-face, I've also seen many of them on television, you have as well, there are a lot of people standing around, maybe even protesting, that wouldn't ever think of throwing a rock through a window. But the first time that a rock goes through that window, it lowers the threshold for someone else who would not have thrown a rock initially, but now is quite willing to throw a rock or throw something like a chair or maybe a newsstand of or some kind of metal or a garbage can or something through the window. That, in a sense, is kind of what's going on. Then there are all sorts of people, even with the window broken, would not think about jumping through the window or going through the door and stealing something. But the moment someone does so, it lowers the threshold and almost makes it, if you will, permissible for someone else to do so. And if you don't think that, let's go back to the research that has been summarized by Malcolm Gladwell. I'd love to get him on the program here. One study found that a majority of the school shooters in the 8 years after Columbine made explicit references to Harris and Klebold, who, of course, were the two shooters, and a majority of the school shootings outside of the United States were also versions of Columbine. So it wasn't just that this was happening in America, but, of course, you can recognize with the advent of media and the internet that is the case as well. And so the kind of discouraging part of all this is they concluded that young men no longer need to be deeply disturbed to contemplate horrific acts. And that goes to the piece that I posted yesterday, and if you have not had a chance to read it, it's by our friend Jim Garrity. It's called Our Angry, Violent Young Men Problem. And what I thought was so interesting is that there is always this tendency to refer to young men as troubled. But interestingly enough, they found that 60% of these mass shooters had either been diagnosed with a mental disorder or exhibited some kind of signs of serious mental illness. But what about the other 40%? It's, 60-40. But the other 40% in most cases could not be attributed to any mental illness. The bottom line is being troubled. Many of them actually lived in fairly affluent communities. And by affluent, they meant that the mean household income, according to one study, was $65,000. That's not a poor community. It's not even real. That's kind of even on the high side of the middle class community. And so it was kind of interesting. And then when you look at that, oftentimes the shooter, if you did some investigation, lived a relatively comfortable life, which is why I come to another study. And again, that'll be the end of the studies here. But this was a study of the 39 school shooters, not including, of course, the one at UNC, but all sorts of others that found that half of them felt that they were bullied, they sought revenge, and some of them had thoughts of suicide. But again, Jim Garrity points out that, wait a minute, bullying, thoughts of suicide, these have all existed for a long time. But something in the 2 decades since the Columbine shooting has spurred troubled young men to believe the best way to deal with their problem is to attempt to murder as many people they don't even know as possible. And so this is, I think, back to the key issue. Even when people sometimes say, well, we can just take the guns out of the hands of these individuals. And the shooter that actually was shooting people in the synagogue in the San Diego area never had a run-in with the law, so it's really hard to imagine how you would ever remove that gun out of his hands, especially in California that has perhaps some of the most restrictive laws that exist on gun control. But more than the point, it isn't the gun, it's who has the gun in their hands, because as I've said before, and I always get criticized when I bring it up, but I'm going to bring it up again anyway, that if you go back to the 1950s and 60s, there were a lot more guns in the schools than there are now, because a lot of the schools had rifle clubs, and the young men would bring the rifle to school. Theoretically, they were unloaded. Realistically, teenagers, come on. Getting my teenager kids to brush their teeth was, a major task. So probably some of those guns came loaded. But we don't have any school shootings there because we had a different kind of mentality, a different kind of motivation then. So again, we can look at suicide, we can look at bullying, we can look at troubled youth, we can look at firearms, but it really comes back to what's in the heart. And if nothing else, the shooting that happened at UNC Charlotte is just another sad testimony of what is unfolding. And if you want to read the entire piece by Jim Garrity, I thought it does a very good job of talking about what is happening with these angry, violent young men. We can add all sorts of other factors, whether it's video games, the level of visual violence, of the justification for shooting since it's happened before. But nevertheless, it's a problem we will still have to live with, and sadly, this will not be the last time we have a school shooting. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into a couple of other issues in the news. A lot to cover today, and I will do so right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, and again, if you were expecting to hear Nick Pitts today, we have decided and will be moving the Millennial Round Table till Tuesday, and that will start on May 7th, next Tuesday, so you'll have a chance to hear him. I'm sitting in today, and we're not necessarily focusing on millennials, since I have no millennials, and I'm not one myself, and there'll be more than a few opportunities in the future to talk about that as well. Let me, for just a few minutes, talk about what's happening in Venezuela, about some of the negotiations happening in the White House, even yesterday, for infrastructure, and then maybe a couple of other very important issues in the news. I don't spend a lot of time on some of these because, after all, there's not much you can do when you see, for example, what's happening in Venezuela other than to pray. You may pray for your leaders and pray for a good outcome. And sometimes I do this, if no other reason, let you know we are paying attention to it. So often I'll have somebody say, well, you didn't mention, well, yes, I mean, we didn't have enough time. We did a book interview and didn't have the time to talk about that. So appreciate the fact that Steve provided me with an opportunity, not only this hour, but 2 hours from now, an open line to kind of focus on a few of those issues, just to give you an update on how to kind of think about what is taking place in some of these situations. And in Venezuela, what you have right now, and I think the Wall Street Journal does a good job of summarizing it, either forces for democratic renewal will actually succeed, or Cuba, and indirectly maybe Russia, will cement their hold on Venezuela. Because you have a battle, obviously, from the Cuban-backed dictator, that would be Nicolas Maduro, as well as the duly elected individual, Juan Guaido. And if nothing else, I wanted to, for just a minute, try to set aside the media narrative. I know this will surprise you, but sometimes the media has a bias about some of these issues. And when they refer to the fact that Juan Guaido is trying to get some of his allies to actually shake up the government so that he can serve, they referred to that as a coup. I think a better definition would be a popular revolt, if nothing else, against an illegitimate leader and a desire to put the duly elected individual in office. But that's not the way it comes across in the press, which is one of the reasons I thought we might talk about that. So the Wall Street Journal simply said that, again, Democratic leaders launched a revolt against the dictator, Nicolas Maduro, yesterday. The stakes couldn't be higher, they say. Either Venezuelans reclaim their freedom, or instability and misery will continue to radiate from Caracas across the Americas, because this will have an impact not just in Venezuela, but in other countries there as well. Ronald Reagan was not an individual who felt that it was appropriate to always deploy troops, but he sent troops to the little island of Grenada because he saw what was happening there. Of course, later, Oliver North, working under him, even figured out a way to supply various arms to the Nicaraguan freedom fighters called the Contras. So even those regimes recognize that if you establish, if you will, a Marxist, socialist, communist beachhead, it doesn't just stay within the country, it goes elsewhere. And as I said, you have right now the media using this kind of glib generalization that this is a coup. But again, Juan Guaido is supposed to be in power, but it has never been released and relinquished by Nicolas Maduro. And he's really, right now, that is, Guaido and his allies, as it says, are gambling that a huge civilian protest will shake the loyalty of military officers who right at the moment feel committed to Nicolas Maduro. So we'll see where that takes place. And the call is kind of, as they said, a high-risk gamble for Juan Guaido because in some respects, if it fails, not only would he be targeted for arrest, but probably for assassination or execution. So we will see what happens this particular week as this unfolds. And, of course, the stakes are not just high for the individual who should be actually serving as the president in Venezuela, but the stakes are very high, as the Wall Street Journal points out, for President Trump, who actually recognized back in January Juan Guaido as the legitimate leader in Venezuela. Yesterday, you even had, if you saw this on the news, the U.S. National Security Advisor, John Bolton, who's been on the program with us before, told reporters outside the White House that key figures in the regime have been talking to the opposition for 3 months, and they need to act now. He specifically mentioned the defense minister, Vladimir Padrino, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the commander of the Presidential Guard. So we'll see where this goes, but I did want to at least mention what is happening there in Venezuela. While there were all these conversations about Venezuela on the White House lawn, there was another series of conversations, and that came as the leaders of both the House and the Senate on the Democratic side, one the actual leader of the House, Speaker of the House, the other leader of the Democratic opposition, if you will, in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, after meeting with Donald Trump, came out and announced that they were going to spend, are you ready for this, $2 trillion on infrastructure. $2 trillion. And I love how, again, the Wall Street Journal put it, who says there's no bipartisanship in Washington? Democrats in Congress visited the White House on Tuesday, and they emerged to say that they and President Trump had agreed to spend $2 trillion on public works. When it comes to spending more money, Washington can always find common ground. Gary Bauer talked about this yesterday, in which he was much more skeptical, and I share his skepticism that this will actually happen. But you will see why in just a minute, because, of course, you have the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, meeting with President Donald Trump to discuss this. And this is to actually spend money on infrastructure, not, as he said, the not-so-shovel-ready stimulus projects that were first put forth by President Obama. But Gary Bauer puts it this way. Everyone knows we need more and better roads, bridges, and airports in the United States. The construction jobs created by these projects could employ tens of thousands of middle-class workers. But he then goes on to say, unfortunately, Schumer and Pelosi are in no mood to make a deal. Before the meeting took place, they issued a statement including a laundry list of poison pills. What are those? Well, sometimes individuals that want to look like they're trying to negotiate throw in some non-negotiable that they know the other side won't go with. It's called a poison pill, and that's that. And so they were, for example, demanding tax hikes and all sorts of things to address climate change. And so, again, Gary Bauer says they want Trump to roll back key elements of his signature tax cuts, which would kill jobs and slam the brakes on economic growth. They want radical regulations to address climate change in those kinds of 2020. And these would, of course, be ways to really hurt small business, he argues. Well, again, this is certainly something that may still happen. The announcement yesterday seems like maybe they came to an agreement, and that makes me even more concerned about what was agreed to behind closed doors. As our friends at the Wall Street Journal put it, the annual federal budget deficit is already $1 trillion. House Democrats couldn't even pass a budget outline because they're radicals in their group, the so-called progressives, and some of the young Democrats wanted an additional $67 billion in domestic spending. And frankly, Republicans on the other side wanted more for defense. And that's before this whole infrastructure blowout. So again, the Democrats have been saying they won't agree to raise gasoline taxes unless Donald Trump agrees to roll back some of his 2017 tax cuts. Don't think that's going to happen. But if indeed the president is entertaining such trade, he's walking into a political trap, because if nothing else, it's certainly going to be a classic illustration of getting everything on the Democrat side and nothing on the Republican side, everything that expands the size and scope of government and doesn't give any kind of freedom and regulatory relief from individuals that are trying to create jobs. And if nothing else, there is going to be some pressure on the president because, after all, he did campaign on rebuilding America's infrastructure. How many times did we hear him saying something about that? But if he and the Democrats don't agree on what to spend it on, we're going to have a problem. And I love the final comment from the editors there. They said, rest assured, the Democrats, when they talk about infrastructure, they don't just merely mean roads and bridges. We've been down this road before with the so-called shovel-ready stimulus, which looked like a lot of it went into the coffers of various unions and things of that nature. So we'll see where that goes, but there is the focus right now on infrastructure is about creating jobs, but it's also about advancing public health on clean air and clean water, addressing climate change, expanding broadband to rural, urban, and other undeserved and underserved areas. So we're going to hear a lot about infrastructure, and when you hear infrastructure, you probably think like I do, bridges and roads and even airports and runways and all the things necessary to keep our economy humming. But unfortunately, the word infrastructure means something very different inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C. When we come back, I'll talk about one other issue that's in the news right now, and we'll try to cover some more of it a little bit later. Let me just give you as a program note, in about 20 minutes, we're also going to be talking with an expert on persecuted Christians from Open Doors. All that coming up right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The whitewashed churches of New England, often contrasted against the reds and yellows of fall foliage, have captured the imagination of painters and photographers everywhere, but not the Supreme Court of the United States. In March of 2019, the justices declined to review an appeal from a New Jersey Supreme Court decision that declared the funding of grants for the historic preservation of these historic church buildings unconstitutional. Such grants allowed local organizations to repair things like shingles, paint, or mechanical work, but not hymn books, altarpieces, or Sunday school lessons. At least a few justices viewed the denial of these funds to churches as religious discrimination. A perplexed and unequivocal Justice Brett Kavanaugh, writing for Justices Alito and Gorsuch, said in a statement, "Barring religious organizations because they are religious from a general historic preservation grants program is pure discrimination against religion." Indeed, it is difficult to conceive of a more unvarnished religious discrimination. The government deciding that religious organizations are ineligible to participate equally in the public square merely because they are religious is precisely the type of religious discrimination the founders were trying to prevent. Justice Kavanaugh is absolutely right in declaring this to be pure discrimination against religion. No state official should discriminate against people of faith or the religious organizations they operate, based merely on their religious status. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then at the top of the hour, we're going to be talking with an individual with Open Doors who actually is going to educate us, as we so often do, about the plight of persecuted Christians, how we can pray for them, how we can support them, and I think you're going to find that very helpful. And we'll come back to some of these issues in the news, but let me real quickly mention two of the articles we've posted. They're the top two articles we've posted on this issue of anti-Semitism. This is the booklet I've written for this month, and it's become prophetic because, as we well know, you've had just another attack on a synagogue, as we talked about yesterday. You also have the FBI report that shows that even though hate crimes have been decreasing and declining in America, The majority of those acts have been against Jewish people and Jewish targets. And then over the last day or two, we've also talked about some of these cartoons that have appeared in the New York Times, which I think most people would assume are anti-Semitic. So one of the things that I did was actually post two other articles. We've already spent a fair amount of time talking about it, but this one by Ben Shapiro, the New York Times, Anti-Semitism is Shocking but Not Surprising, because he goes through, as we tried to just the other day, talking about how some of these images look like even some of those that you would see in the 1930s and 40s in Germany about various Jewish people, and how the New York Times in many cases has been very critical of Jewish people or of the nation of Israel. So that's the first article we've posted, and that one I would encourage you to read. We might even come back to it a little bit later in the next hour or so. And then also Dennis Prager, Why Most Jews Aren't Bothered by the Times Anti-Semitic Cartoons. And again, just illustrating that it's almost like, well, we've seen this before. We're not surprised. But again, to me, the greatest surprise was that after they, first of all, published that first cartoon, and how did they do that in the first place? Benjamin Netanyahu, looking like a dog with a Star of David around his collar, leading a blind Donald Trump, and not thinking that that was maybe also anti-Semitic as well as sort of anti-Israel. And then after that, you would think that they would probably, as we used to jokingly say, got their fingers burned up to the second knuckle because of all the reaction. Then they posted another one just a few days later, Benjamin Netanyahu. It's just beyond me. In any way, one of the arguments being made both by Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager, both been on the program with us, is you shouldn't be surprised if you know the history of the New York Times and even just kind of the anti-religious bias that exists today, which is, of course, a great setup for the anti-religious bias against Christians worldwide. So that's certainly another issue that we will get to. But I thought I'd also bring very quickly a piece that Kevin Williamson has done, because one of the arguments being made right now during the campaign on the Democratic side, primarily by Bernie Sanders, is for extending voter rights to prisoners who are currently incarcerated. And so that means like Terry Nichols, remember the Oklahoma City bombing, Drozek Sarnoff, remember the Boston bomber, Nadel Hassan killing those individuals, various Aryan Brotherhood, and on and on and on. And, of course, they're not doing it because they feel that this would be fair. I think they're doing it primarily because they believe that they would be able to get some votes. Matter of fact, as he says here, Democrats probably are less interested in supermax cloistered terrorists than in African Americans, who are more than twice as likely to vote Democrat as white voters in 2018. But the argument he makes is a good one. If we're really serious about, okay, we're hearing right now that why, when a person has been convicted of a felony, does that keep him or her from ever being allowed to vote? First of all, sometimes there are pardons that come down. Chuck Colson would be a great example of an individual who was pardoned and then allowed to exercise the vote. But if indeed we believe that once a person has served their time, they've been rehabilitated, this should not be some kind of label or stigma that prevents them from doing anything, well, then think about this, because we exclude felons not only from voting, but for the very same reason we exclude them from practicing law, because we don't trust them with the power, because they've already demonstrated a contempt for law. And if really people were serious, as he points out, about completely restoring the civil and social status of felons after their release, then we would, among other things, and I love his list, allow them to buy and keep guns, to serve in security-sensitive positions, to be protected from exclusion in professional licensure and discrimination in hiring. And he says none of that is talked about very much. The discussion mostly begins and ends on voting rights. Cynical, as he said, but predictable. But I think this is a conversation that even though Bernie Sanders is doing for one reason and one reason only, and that is to see if he can find a way to get more Democrat votes, maybe even in the prisons, but I think there is reason to come back to this whole idea of criminal justice. Because let's just use one of the examples, since we're tight on time here, that Kevin Williamson uses. Because it's amazing how you can sometimes be convicted of a felony. And we always make a distinction between violent felons and nonviolent ones. But let's talk about the nonviolent felons that have never done anything to harm another individual. But you can, under the law, actually be declared a felon if you fail to make court-ordered child support payments. And as a matter of fact, if you are ordered to make child support payments and you are more than 2 years past due, or the amount is more than $10,000, guess what? You're a felon. And I think his argument's a good one. People who are ordered to make child support payments should make them, but those who fail to do so should not be put in the same class as Terry Nichols, the Oklahoma City bomber, or Nidal Hassan, the individual that shot all those individuals at the Army base. So he's making a point about the fact there are many convicted criminals who can be rehabilitated, and we should want to see them rehabilitated, which is almost impossible to achieve if they are economically handicapped for the rest of their lives. And so it's something to have a conversation about, but at the same time, I fully recognize that this conversation is motivated in large part simply by individuals that find themselves wanting to, if nothing else, get a few more votes come next November. I might mention that just before we take a break, there's a couple of commentaries that you might want to pay attention to. My one yesterday was talking about defenders of Western civilization. And since I mentioned Ben Shapiro, I could also add another individual, Jonah Goldberg, who make a point about the fact that you have people that criticize Western civilization even though they're benefiting from it, which I think is always ironic. And Jonah Goldberg uses a great illustration that helps you understand what's going on. He said, imagine a party platform that has as its planks support for human rights, belief in the rule of law, dedication to democracy, free speech, freedom of conscience, admiration of the scientific method, property rights, and tolerance of technological and or cultural innovation. He argues that 90%, I'd say even more than 90% of the people who criticize Western civilization believe these rights and those things come from Western civilization. The other one I want to point to is today's commentary called Spying or Surveillance, because you know that the Attorney General today was, of course, before the Senate panel, but the other day caused quite a stir when he actually said, then concluded that the government had been spying on the president. Well, the quick reaction from many people is, no, it was just surveillance. And as I point out from this particular piece that was done by Kevin Brock, who knows a lot about this, surveillance actually is even worse than spying. And so sometimes trying to make this semantic distinction actually plays into the hands of those that have been so critical about what was done and what has been done to President Donald Trump. So you can read that one as well, and those are all available on our website, pointofview.net. We come back, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about persecuted Christians and what you as a Christian can do to help them and to pray for them. All that coming up right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We're going to be spending some time over the next couple of hours looking at issues in the news, although I'm going to postpone most of that conversation to the next hour. The Attorney General William Barr has been on front of the Senate panel, and we're going to talk about that and the special counsel and a number of issues that have surfaced from some of that testimony. We had a shooting yesterday at UNC Charlotte. Again, University of North Carolina, so we'll get back into that issue, which we were talking about yesterday in terms of the shooting, interestingly enough, at a synagogue near San Diego, but now we'll come back to that conversation. Turmoil in Venezuela, we'll be talking about what that might mean as well, and some evidence that a deal has been made between the president and the two leaders of the Democratic Party in the House and the Senate on the issue of infrastructure, to mention just a few topics we'll get to later. But we're going to focus our time and attention, as we do so often here on Point of View, on the plight of persecuted Christians. If you've listened to any of the conversations we've had, for example, in the last couple of years with David Curry and other people with Open Doors, you're familiar with that. More recently, we had somebody in studio here that has worked in the past with a Voice of the Martyrs. So we certainly believe that you should be in prayer, especially tomorrow, our National Day of Prayer, to pray for those in authority and to pray for believers. So that is what we're going to focus our time and attention on, because we're privileged to have in studio with us today Wybo, and he is from the Netherlands, is married, has two grown children, currently serves as the Chief Strategy Officer for Open Doors, and actually started with Open Doors as early as 1985 as a researcher for the Soviet Union inside Eastern Europe. I travel every year to Budapest, Hungary. Matter of fact, later this month I'll be there. And, of course, even has been Open Doors Deputy Director for the Middle East. And so because of his experience in so many different venues and so many places around the world, really will give us a perspective that we always value. So, Wybo, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be in your program.
Can you share how you first came to work with Open Doors? Because that's kind of a fun story too, isn't it?
Oh, that's a long time ago.
Yes.
Yeah, no, that was 85. I was fascinated by the situation of our brothers and sisters behind the Iron Curtain.
Right.
Raised up in the Netherlands, just a 4 hours drive from the Iron Curtain. I was studying modern history, focusing on the persecuted church in the former Soviet Union, ready to write my thesis. And then all of a sudden there is a ad in the magazine of Open Doors. We are looking for research. And I think, can't be true. I can combine my passion with my training, my skills in university.
Yes.
So I wrote a letter, and 2 weeks later, I was on.
Yes, well, again, just a great story, because if nothing else, you brought academic perspective, heart, and then, if you have nothing else, an emotional connection as well. And so, first of all, let's just remind people of what it is like around the world. And one of the things I'll mention, and we have some of these booklets we'd make available. Anybody that doesn't have one and you want to drop by, if you're in the Dallas area, we'll give you one. Otherwise, we have a link to Open Doors, because this is the World Watch list. And every year with David Curry, we go through those. Now, in the past, it's always been the case that North Korea is at the top of the list, and then the others are Muslim countries. One interesting change, North Korea is still at the top of the list, then Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya, and all the way down. But number 10 is India. I don't think most people knew that, unless, like in my case, I have a staff member whose kids actually have been over there, to recognize how very intense it's becoming, even in the country of India. Tell us about that.
Well, you're right on. One of the most important changes in the World Watch list over the past 5 years has been the rise of India, and even reaching now the top 10. And this is a very serious situation. What is going on in India? India is being ruled by President Mr. Modi. He has backing of the largest political party, the BJP. And Mr. Modi and the BJP, they have two goals for their country. One is to modernize, liberalize the economy, which so far has been a real blessing for the country and for hundreds of millions of Indian citizens. But the other priority is to change India into a 100% Hindu country. Yes. This has been really bad news for the Christian minority. And they have been able to get away with a lot of bad things. But frankly, when we look to 2018, we had over 600 recorded serious incidents. That was more than in the country of Iraq or Syria. And whereas it's common knowledge that things are bad in Iraq and Syria or Iran, is not the case for India.
Sure. Well, in Syria, I think is 11th, and Iraq is like 13th, something like that. So, yes, I guess that's right. And so, again, you recognize that apart from India or North Korea, most of these countries are Muslim countries. And I remember years ago doing an interview when Brother Andrew was on the radio. When you've been doing radio as long as I have, you've actually interviewed almost everybody. And he was at the time telling us that he started with the concern that the place where there would be the greatest persecution would be behind the Iron Curtain because of the communist countries. Now, I'm not minimizing North Korea or China because those are very significant as well. But he began to see something which we, of course, now take for granted, and that is that most of these countries where there is the greatest persecution of Christians today are in Muslim countries. And for those of us concerned about missions, if you look at the so-called 1040 window, that's where a lot of it takes place. So explain a little bit more about what you found in terms of what it is like to be a Christian in these Muslim-dominated countries.
Well, first of all, there is a major challenge in the faith of Islam that according to the rules of this religion, you cannot step out, you cannot leave. So when you are born into an Islamic family, you do not have the freedom to leave this religion, even though you yourself may have no faith at all. And this is a major challenge for millions of Muslims who are seekers nowadays, and many of them actually would like to make a decision for Christ, but they are living in fear because they know there can be very serious repercussions when they do so. At the same time, in most of the Islamic countries, there's a Christian minority. In some cases, they have some rights, but they are discriminated against. In some other countries, they hardly have any rights, and they are struggling. So we are dealing with two types of Christian believers who are facing a challenge of radical Islam.
I might just mention, too, with the World Watch list, you have some that are extreme persecution, which we've certainly been talking about, then high persecution, even others that find themselves, and again, if you look at this world, except for North America and parts of South America, and a few places like Australia and elsewhere, persecution really is kind of what is happening around the world. And so for the Christian living here and thinking, well, we don't really face persecution here, which is true, but almost any other country you will travel to, it seems like a lot of those are. And again, some of the outliers used to be places where persecution took place, like in Europe. You know, now when I go to Budapest, Hungary, it used to be that in the castle where we teach with Word of Life, that was a place that was used to indoctrinate students in communism. Now that same facility is used to actually teach a Christian worldview and to educate others. But when we come back, I want to spend some time talking about what is happening in some of those key countries. What can we do about it? How we can pray for those individuals. And as you go to the website, pointofview.net, we have a link to Open Doors. And I would encourage you to just go directly to opendoorsusa.org, but you don't have to remember all that because we have the link there. And you will find a lot more information. And if you're not supporting this organization, I would encourage you to do so. So we are privileged to have in studio with us today Wybo, and he will give us a better understanding of all of this. But maybe you've had some questions about this as well. So early on, I'm going to open up the phones in case you have a comment or question about persecution of Christians around the world. If you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. We'll continue our conversation about persecuted Christians and about the church around the world with Open Doors right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The Attorney General, William Barr, caused quite a stir the other day when he concluded the government had been engaged in spying. The sentence that generated the outrage was this: "I believe the government spied on the Trump campaign." His statement led to another round of commentators arguing that this was merely surveillance, not spying. But in a recent article in The Hill, Kevin Brock explains that even attempting to make a semantic difference misses what was done. He should know, since he was the former assistant director of intelligence for the FBI and served as an FBI special agent for 24 years and was the principal deputy director of the National Counterterrorism Center. He explains that what was unleashed on an American citizen was without precedent. The FISA surveillance allows the clandestine microphone and camera capture of the target at all times in all places, even the most intimate of his daily life. It is more intrusive than even a Title III criminal wiretap for a drug dealer or a mob boss. There really is a major difference between spying and FISA court-ordered surveillance. He says it is the epitome of government power over an individual's privacy. It is the nuclear option in the world of intelligence collection. He also reminds us that the government only uses such an option when surveilling foreign nationals who have been spying on U.S. interest, or sometimes for U.S. citizens who hold security clearances and possess national security information that might be turned over to another country. It has never been used by an FBI director or deputy director to intercept an individual with no clearance or obvious access to sensitive information. Please remember this the next time you hear someone reject the idea that the government was spying on the Trump campaign and suggesting that it was only surveillance. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. And we have Wybo in studio with us today, an individual that actually serves as the Chief Strategy Officer for Open Doors. If you're not familiar with Open Doors, let me encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net, and follow the link, or you can just simply go to opendoorsusa.org. And first of all, I would encourage you to read some of the material that is there. There at the very bottom is a video that's about a little less than 3 minutes long. I would encourage you to watch that because it talks about Open Doors. We serve persecuted Christians. And then in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a share button there. And I would encourage you to click that button, and then you could put it on your Facebook page, or you could put it on a Twitter feed, or maybe put it on your blog if you have such a thing, or send it by email to a pastor in your church. Because so often when we talk about the Sunday to pray for the persecuted church, or people say, well, what can I do for persecuted Christians? They may or may not be familiar with what is happening through Open Doors. Again, you would think most people would know about it. An organization's been around for decades, but that's still the case. You know, every new generation needs to know more about that. And so I would encourage you to take some of that material and pass it on as you are listening today to some of the conversation that we're having about these persecuted Christians. And even yesterday, one of the things that was interesting, in the very first hour, we had an individual talking about going to some of these very isolated places in India, which are up in the mountains because you get into the Himalayas at that point. And so talking about sharing Christ with an individual who was speaking in one language to another person who was Bhutanese to talk to another, because you have India, Bhutan, and all of those together. Now, all of those are places under very high persecution. And yet, even in those environments, there's still opportunities for missionary work, isn't there?
Yeah, this story has really two sides. The downside is the level of persecution. As I mentioned, persecution has been on the rise in India. The government has implemented new legislation in a number of states, anti-conversion laws, so Christians no longer legally are having the right to evangelize, to share their faith. And the price they are paying for that is very real. For us, a very disturbing development in the last year has been that no longer often pastors, church leaders were targeted, but it could be the families of the pastors or even their children. And just to give you one example of that, as to show how serious this is, we were in touch with a pastor whose daughter was about 8-9 years old. She was going to school. And early afternoon, the pastor and his wife received a phone call from the head of the school saying, well, your daughter is not really ill. Maybe you can pick her up. And the wife of the pastor was a little bit surprised because in the morning when the daughter was taken to school, she was all fine. But they picked up their daughter, and indeed she was very silent, a little bit pale. And the parents really didn't understand what happened to the girl and why she was not feeling well. And she didn't say much. So in the end, they decided to take her to a local doctor who did a quick examination. And after 10 minutes, he came back to the parents and said, I'm really sorry for you, but I have bad news. Your daughter has just been raped in school, probably by some radical Hindus. And this is one means radical Hindus are trying to put pressure on Christians to stop evangelizing and no longer share the faith.
That's right.
So this is one side of the story, but the good side of the story is that the church is really growing in India, in Nepal, in Bhutan. For example, I went through India for the first time in 1992. At that time, the number of Christians was estimated between maybe 25, 28, up to 40 million. Today, if you would visit India again, estimates run from starting at 60 million, going over 70 million. So God is building his church in this country, but unfortunately nowadays often in the midst of a lot of persecution.
And there's kind of a cyclical. Let me use India, use that example. Let's talk about China for just a minute because it's on the list as well. There was a time when there seemed to be a real openness to the West in China, and even an openness to Christian churches. But now we see Christian churches being torn down. We see more and more pastors being incarcerated. So it's sometimes cyclical, and you wonder if sometimes there's an attempt to have an openness so we know who all the potential enemies are, and then we have another kind of cultural revolution. What's going on there?
We are very concerned about the situation of the church in China, so thanks for asking. And you are also right, for a long time the situation improved year by year inside China, and the situation of the church actually became better throughout a number of decades. But the pendulum started to change maybe 3-4 years ago, and since then, basically every year since 2014, the situation has become a little bit more complicated for the Chinese church. The information we are receiving from China is that the Communist Party, who is still controlling the country, the only party allowed to exist in this country, is fearing the size of the Christians. There are just over 100 million party members. At the same time, there are over 100 million Christians. It's really a shame because the Christians do not have political aspirations to take over the country. They just would like to live freely as followers of Jesus Christ. And normally, being Christians, they are providing good service to the society as well. So we hope and pray for a change in the direction of the current Chinese government, but unfortunately, it has been a negative change for the past 3-4 years.
And I've heard individuals that have come back from China saying that for a while, the officials in China really said, we want Christians because they tend to work harder, tend to be honest, tend less likely to use drugs, alcohol, and a variety of other things. So they were the good workers that sometimes they wanted. And yet now, of course, we see what's happening there. And since we're talking about communism, let's go to North Korea because that is the number one on the list. And, of course, when Open Doors began, that was really the focus. What's happening behind the Iron Curtain, what's happening behind the bamboo curtain. But North Korea is a striking example because you see the flourishing of Christian values and Christian ideas in South Korea. You see the incredible and just unbelievable persecution in North Korea. Yet we've had a chance sometimes to talk to some individuals that have been able to go in there and say that the church may be still vibrant, even in the midst of some of the most horrific persecution on the planet.
You're completely correct. There is still a church alive in North Korea. It is deeply, deeply underground. North Korean Christians have to be extremely careful to share their faith, even towards their own children, because normally the sentence for showing that you are Christians is labor camp, and then many Christians will not survive the labor camp. When they are in a labor camp, they are not allowed just to raise their heads towards the sky. They have to look down, even to avoid a physical connection with heaven. So persecution definitely is the most extreme in North Korea, and there has been no openness whatsoever by the current regime towards more respect for human rights, let alone freedom of religion.
Just before we take a break, let's begin to talk about what we can do. When we come back, I want to talk a bit more about what's happening in Muslim countries, but some people by now say, okay, you got my attention. I know that I'm supposed to pray for those individuals, but I don't know how to pray for them. I don't know how I can help. I don't know how I can help you strengthen those individuals there. So for just a few minutes, talk about how our listeners can connect up with you at Open Doors to make a difference in the lives of these individuals.
The number one request for help from the persecuted church is prayer. So we would love to invite you as American Christians to pray for the persecuted church. We have a website. We put out daily new prayer items, so you get the most up-to-date information, what is going on and what kind of topics do we need to pray for. The prayer items are coming directly from our field teams, or our field teams are required to send their most urgent prayer teams to a national bank of collection of prayer points. So please join us in this effort to pray for the persecuted church, because prayer really makes a difference.
And we do have a link to opendoorsusa.org, and I would encourage you to, again, take some of this information. Matter of fact, we are going to make available, as we always do, a podcast. So there's an opportunity for you to pass that on maybe to your missions pastor or your prayer coordinator in your church, and that's one thing that you can do. Of course, we'll also put this on YouTube. You'll see my face and not the face of the individual I'm interviewing, and you probably can imagine why that is the case. And so that is something also that you can pass on to others to help them understand a little bit more about the need to pray for these individuals. And as I have had a chance over the years to interview some of the people that have been persecuted Christians, but one of the things that strikes me is they don't say, don't pray that I won't be persecuted, pray that I will be strengthened in the midst of the persecution. That's pretty humbling for me.
It is. They are praying to stand strong. And actually, that's our call also to us here in the States, to stand strong for Jesus Christ.
That's for sure. Let's take a break, and when we come back, let's open up the phones. I suspect some of you maybe have some comments or questions. Maybe you've traveled to some of these countries and have observed some of that, or maybe you would like to know a little bit more about a particular country, because we have the entire World Watch list here. Let me encourage you to get a copy of that and maybe get multiple copies. I'll hold one up here for those of you watching online. This would be something that would really, I think, energize your prayer life, the prayer life of your church. It would also give you kind of a world view, which we talk about so often here on this program. And if nothing else, just help you appreciate the incredible amount of freedom we as Christians in this country certainly enjoy compared to what is happening around the world. So let's, if we can, take a break. But if you'd like to join our conversation today, let's open up the phones. 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212, talking about persecuted Christians, talking with Open Doors. And again, go to opendoorsusa.org. We'll be back right after this.
Here's some great news. If you missed the deadline to sign up for health insurance, or more importantly, if you sign up for a plan that you're just not happy with, you still have a choice. It's called MediShare, and MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing program. It's been around for 25 years. They have more than 400,000 members now around the country. And get this, over the years, MediShare members have shared more than $2 billion of each other's medical bills, so they could help share your needs too. And best of all, you could save a lot of money with MediShare. The typical savings for a family is around $500 a month. Your savings could be more or less, but think about what you could do with that extra money every month. So if you think you're stuck with a high-cost health plan that doesn't have much to offer, think again. You can join MediShare anytime, so call them today and check it out. There's no pressure. They're super easy to talk to. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join a conversation, 1-800-351-1212, talking with our good friend from Open Doors, Chief Strategy Officer. Wybo is with us in studio, and we have a link to opendoorsusa.org, and I would encourage you to go there, one, to subscribe to their newsletter. That way you get these updated prayer requests, and this is such a great opportunity for you to pray, the privilege of praying for persecuted Christians around the world. There's a place for you to donate, and it also gives you some great information. Open Doors now is supporting persecuted believers in more than 60 countries. Wybo, I'm just old enough to remember when it used to be you were supporting Christians in about almost half those number of countries. A lot of that is due to Islam, isn't it not?
Yeah, we have seen a tremendous change in the past 10 years where the situation for many Christians, and especially Islamic countries, has become much more serious, much more complicated. That's true for a number of countries in Africa. It's also true for countries in Asia, unfortunately.
Well, I want to talk about those Muslim countries, but let's again point everybody right now. If you are near a computer, go to, again, either pointofview.net. We have a link there. Or if you want to type it all out, opendoorsUSA.org. In either way, you'll find a place where you can subscribe and donate. And if there are people that say, well, this is something I'd like to feature in my missions conference at my church, or I really want our prayer ministry or a missions pastor to talk about that, are there some resources they can get from you to pass on to others that are in positions of leadership?
Yeah, if they could visit our website, we have all kinds of materials available. We also have speakers available who are really knowledgeable on the topics. And every now and again, very regularly actually, we have field staff visiting the States, so you can get a personal update. How is the situation in India? How is the situation in Iraq? How's the situation in Nigeria? You can have a personal encounter with people from these countries who have gone often through persecution themselves.
Well, again, I just think that would just be outstanding, and I think it would really be a great call to prayer within the churches. So again, opendoorsUSA.org. My assignment for you is to scroll down, and on the bottom there, you're going to find a nice video. It's about 3 minutes long, and it really kind of gives a good overview of Open Doors, gives you some scripture passages, gives you some pictures and things like that. And I would encourage you, first of all, to watch it. It won't take you more than 3 minutes. And then there's a share button on that upper right-hand corner. Share it with others and educate them as you are being educated right now as we're talking with Wybo. Okay, let's talk about these Muslim countries. Afghanistan, right beneath North Korea, Somalia, Libya, Pakistan, Sudan. These are all places where there is just incredible persecution of Christians. Give us a feel for what you've discovered there at Open Doors.
What I really would like to highlight this morning with you is that persecution is not just coming from extremist movements. This is one driver, one source of persecution. It's a real one. It's a very heavy one. But there's also a lot of persecution coming from the community, sometimes from your own family. And
yes,
to give you one example, Pakistan is quite high in the list, number 5. It's the testimony of a boy, a teenager actually. He was 17 years old. He was going to school, starting the school year in September. And Pakistan, if you look at the place on the globe, Pakistan is located in an area where the temperatures can be quite high.
Yes.
Unless the beautiful studio here in Dallas where we have airco, many school buildings in Pakistan do not have airco. And when this kid was going to school, first day in the school year, sitting in class, everybody was sweating. It was very, very humid and warm in the class. And he noticed that his teacher was struggling as well. And he just wanted to be nice. So he picked up a glass of water, and as a Christian, he presented that to his teacher. However, his teacher was a Muslim. And this is something you are not supposed to do in a country like Pakistan. So when he handed over this glass of water to his teacher, his classmates turned on him, were very, very angry that a Christian was defiling a Muslim, and they started to beat him up. And actually, they were beating him up inside the classroom, and they continued until he had died.
Wow.
He was murdered. He was a martyr because he gave a glass of water away to a Muslim. So just an example of the intensity of persecution which can happen in an Islamic country like Pakistan.
Well, and a lot of these countries are dominated by Sharia law. And of course, one of the things I've written about, of course, as you well know in my books and other things, is that this, first of all, puts it in a situation where, first of all, Muslims have more rights than non-Muslims. Men have more rights than women. And so it's very easy, if you are not aware of all the Muslim thinking and the rulings from the local imam, to cross a line even unintentionally. And as you point out, this tragic story of this Pakistani boy is just one example of what it's like to live in that oppressive regime. What are some of other things that you've run into in some of these Muslim countries? Because there has always been a prohibition against allowing Christians to have anything that would look like human rights or religious liberty. And so obviously that's one of the things that is really affecting the church, if you will, the body of Christ in these Muslim countries, right?
Oh, yes. I mean, we are here in the States. We have a completely legal Christian radio program here, and it's wonderful. Unfortunately, this freedom is totally lacking in most of the Islamic nations where Christians do not have access to the national media. Actually, it's even worse. They do not only have access, they're being ridiculed, they're being attacked in the national media as well.
One of the things that we have heard from Joel Rosenberg, who sits in that chair every time he comes through town, is that we have more Muslims coming to know the Lord in just the last few decades than in the previous more than a millennia. So even in the midst of this unbelievable persecution, we're seeing a lot of individuals through dreams, through testimony, through various kinds of radio programs, internet and other things coming to know Jesus Christ.
It's fantastic how the Lord is doing something new. I totally agree with the statistics of Joel Rosenberg. They are the same as ours. In the past 30 years, more Muslims have come to faith than in the past 1,000 years, for sure. So God is building his work. He is using 3 different ways of bringing people to him. I'll quickly start with the first one, and that is indeed signs and miracles. I remember we had sent a team into a very, very staunch Islamic city in the central part of Iran. There was a secret meeting going on of believers there, and we told them you're allowed to try to visit this underground church, find out where the meeting place is, and then try to meet the believers. So they were trying to spot out the place, and while they were walking in that area, a lady comes up to them, and she's quite emotional, and she says, welcome, welcome, friends from Holland. This happened to be a couple from the Netherlands. And they were wondering, how does she know that we are Dutch, and why is she welcoming us? So they first did not really trust her, but then in the end they said, okay, we can take a chance. This is a lady on her own. So she followed her into her house, and then she started to explain. She says, I just have become a Christian. I was praying, and then I felt the Holy Spirit was speaking to me. I have to welcome some friends from the Netherlands. At first, I tried to push this thought away, but then I simply looked out of my window. I saw 2 foreigners walking in my street, and I was thinking, maybe this is of the Lord. So I went outside and I invited you in. And then they asked her, okay, you have come recently to Jesus. Can you explain why? And she said, sure enough. I was walking on the street. A man touched me on my right shoulder. I turned around. I looked in the eyes of a person and had never seen such eyes before. On the one hand, this man looked right through me as if he could read me from inside out. At the same time, I had never seen so much love in the eyes of a human being. He just looked at me. He said, I am Jesus. If you want to follow, just follow me. I will save you, and I will bring you to a place where people will tell more about me. And she said, I was ready to follow him until the end of the earth. But he took her to this underground meeting place. There he left her. She was introduced to the group of believers, and she gave her heart to Christ, and she is still on fire for Jesus today.
What a great story. I'm so glad you shared that. I have a line around here that I use every once in a while. If that doesn't light your fire, your wood is wet, because that one is a great story indeed. And again, we are seeing certainly from signs and wonders. We're also seeing that even as you travel to these countries, and I would say to some of our listeners, as you travel, sometimes you can, in one way or another, because you're fortunate that you have an American passport, sometimes you can get away with some things. And of course, I know individuals like Brother Andrew, and one of his former secretaries used to work with my ministry years and years ago, what they used to do to get Bibles in there. So there's some various things that people can creatively do to reach out to those countries, right?
Do go, because a lot of these countries are open. Even though your passport may sometimes work against you, at the same time, when you come from America, they are expecting you are a Christian. And for a Muslim, it's just natural to have a faith. So it's very easy to travel into a Muslim country and show your faith. Don't be afraid for that. They are looking forward to have an encounter with a Christian. And many of them are open to have a serious conversation. It's a beautiful opportunity.
Just don't be the stereotype of the ugly Christian, right? Or the ugly American, but do what you can to be sweet and gracious, but also I think you'll have a great opportunity. And you'll find there's more openness sometimes to talk about your faith in those countries than there is even here in the United States. But we need to take a break. We will be with us a little bit longer. You'll stay around one more because I want to hear at least another great story, although these are all great stories today. And if you find yourself saying, okay, I need to hear some of these or share these with individuals, of course, you can download the podcast or simply go, as we have encouraged you to do, to click on that button that says See More. And next to that says Open Doors, you can find everything right there at opendoorsusa.org. We've got a lot of great information there where you can subscribe to the newsletter. You can get maybe even this World Watch list. And most importantly, I hope you'll donate and help out this organization. We'll take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The whitewashed churches of New England, often contrasted against the reds and yellows of fall foliage, have captured the imagination of painters and photographers everywhere. but not the Supreme Court of the United States. In March of 2019, the justices declined to review an appeal from a New Jersey Supreme Court decision that declared the funding of grants for the historic preservation of these historic church buildings unconstitutional. Such grants allowed local organizations to repair things like shingles, paint, or mechanical work, but not hymn books, altarpieces, or Sunday school lessons. At least a few justices viewed the denial of these funds to churches as religious discrimination. A perplexed and unequivocal Justice Brett Kavanaugh, writing for Justices Alito and Gorsuch, said in a statement, "Barring religious organizations because they are religious from a general historic preservation grants program is pure discrimination against religion." Indeed, it is difficult to conceive of a more unvarnished religious discrimination. The government deciding that religious organizations are ineligible to participate equally in the public square merely because they are religious is precisely the type of religious discrimination the founders were trying to prevent. Justice Kavanaugh is absolutely right in declaring this to be pure discrimination against religion. No state official should discriminate against people of faith or the religious organizations they operate, based merely on their religious status. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Point of View, Truth Team 360.
If I hear it from somewhere else, I don't consider it credible until I hear it from Point of View. There are so few people fighting on the front lines for our freedoms. I think Point of View certainly is one of those. And without ministries like Point of View, we really don't have much hope for the future of our children, our grandchildren. They just really help on a daily basis protect the freedoms that we enjoy today. I can't see a better way to invest in our future than to support Point of View.
Point of View is absolutely valuable to the listeners who want to hear the truth. Today, the media, you just cannot trust them, whether it's print or electronic media, and we depend on Point of View to deliver to us the truth. Without Point of View, I do not know where people would turn to get the message that they need to hear about truth in our culture today. Please, please consider supporting Point of View.
Point of View, Truth Team 360.
One of the reasons we do Point of View is we certainly want to educate you about issues. And I know that from time to time, maybe you even hear Open Doors on the mainstream media, but probably not very often, and certainly not this long and detailed interview that we are providing today. So if you would consider supporting this ministry, we'd greatly appreciate that. And let me, if nothing else, direct you instead to giving to Point of View this hour to give instead to Open Doors. And we have a link there. And so if you want to follow up, you can subscribe to their newsletter. You can donate, and I would encourage you to do what you can to encourage those individuals who are working to minister and encourage individuals around the world, believers, and also producing the World Watch list of the 50 countries where it's most dangerous to follow Jesus. Now, we talked about some of these visions, but also this medium that we're using right now, radio, and the internet are some other ways that you've been able to be an encouragement to these persecuted Christians, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Radio, satellite TV, internet are wonderful tools to go beyond borders, to cross borders without being hindered or with few limitations. It has been a real joy to be involved in this part of reaching out seekers from Islam in a new way, in a more creative way, maybe even. And we have many testimonies about that. And some of those testimonies I think are really special. Let me quickly share one of those. It's a story about a criminal, a full-time criminal, a professional criminal from Iran, actually from Tehran. He was trying to rob an apartment. And actually, while he was searching for something of value in this apartment, the owner was there. He took a knife, he threatened the owner. He said, "Give you something of value, otherwise I kill you." And this owner was quite courageous. He said, "Well, bad luck for you today because I don't have anything of real value." And now this criminal was really got angry with him and said, "I'm really going to stab you if you don't give me something of value." So now the owner backed up. He said, "Well, maybe the only thing of value in my house is my satellite dish for the TV." He said, "Okay, give me your satellite dish." So this criminal stole the satellite dish. He took it to his home, and he was able to connect it to his TV. And then he started to look for a channel broadcasting in Farsi, his language. And you can imagine what happened. The first channel he's running into is a Christian teaching program. And actually, it has a very traditional message. The pastor is telling his people, the watchers, you have to repent. You all know that you are sinners, and you know where sinners will end up. They will end up in hell. However, there is a way out if you convert, change your life, and become a follower of Jesus. And this criminal is watching this program, and he's thinking, this is about me. Mm-hmm. God is speaking to me. So he goes on his knees, and he actually follows the advice of the preacher, and he gives his life to Christ. Not only that, he really is serious about his faith, and he is starting to share his faith, his newly found faith, with his friends, who are also full-time criminals. So some of those bad guys are converted as well, and then after a few months, they're trying to link up to a Christian church. And when they are trying to make a link, the pastor of the church is a bit scared for them because they still look like criminals, and he's wondering what to do about those guys.
Right.
So the Lord is working in special ways, and radio, satellite TV, internet ministry definitely are parts of that.
And again, we just see that God's word does not return void. And we see that these new technologies, they're not so new now, but certainly for those of us older around the table, remember a time when we didn't have the internet and the only radio was Radio Free Europe and those kinds of things. But we do have some great technologies. And I worked with individuals that sometimes have done those in Farsi. Some of my articles are in Arabic, and I'd like to get some in Farsi and a variety of other languages as well, because this is just another opportunity to help them understand that a Christian worldview applies to every area of their life. And we don't want them to be just better Christian criminals. We want them to leave the profession that they have chosen for themselves. But an incredible series of stories. And that's one of the reasons why I would suggest for a few minutes that people should subscribe to your newsletter, because you have those kinds of stories every day. If you find yourself saying, well, these are great stories, I want to share them with my friends. What happens when people sign up for your newsletter? What kind of information comes down to them on a regular basis?
It is information to pray. It is information how a persecution looks like, but it's also information how God is building his church. And that is beautiful too. One of the stories you could have read in our magazine is the testimony of a refugee family from Syria, Muslims. They ran away, ended up in Lebanon, and they were trying to survive. And the woman had heard that there was a church in the neighborhood providing food parcels. So she went over there, she sat into a service, and after the service she asked the pastor, well, I'm a refugee from Syria, my husband and I, we are struggling. Would you allow me to have some food parcels as well? They went through the interview, and then it was actually the deacon, and he looked at her and said, I'm sorry, you are in a bad situation, but not bad enough that we can help you. So she was on one hand disappointed, but on the other hand, she had enjoyed the service. So she kept on coming back every week to the service. 3 months later, she went again to the deacon. She says, Mister, I have a problem. My husband has found a little job. We are very happy with that, but he's had an accident. He hurt his shoulder and his upper arm. He needs to have a brace, and we can't afford a brace. Could you help us? And the deacon looked at her and said, I remember you. You have been coming to our church frequently. And she said, yes. He says, well, then you have noticed that every week we do a collection for somebody in need. This week and already next week we have somebody on the list, but in 2 weeks from now we're going to do a collection for your husband. And you can imagine what happened. They just raised enough money to pay for the brace. So she took the money, ran back home, very, very excited that they would receive help. And she gives the money to her husband, and he stares at her. He doesn't say anything. He pauses for a while. He thinks, and he said, follow me. She doesn't know what's going on. He's following her. He's going into the nearest mosque. And there he's asking for a meeting with the local mullah and all the sheikhs. And after some time, they have gathered there. And then he starts to talk. He said, "Hey guys, we have been here as a refugee Islamic family for several months. You never ever asked us how we are doing, let alone offered some help. Look at my wife. She has been going to this Christian meeting as a Muslim. I have never set a foot in this church, and these people have held a collection to help me with my problem. They don't even know me. I've had enough of you. I've had enough of Islam. We are going to this church. I want to be a follower of that man." And both of them converted. Both of them are followers of Christ now and have been baptized in the meantime.
Yeah, such a great story. So many good stories there at Open Doors. And Wybo, thank you so much for taking the time and giving us an hour today. And thank you for your service since, 1985? And again, if you find yourself wanting some more information, again, we have a link to Open Doors. You might want to get this list of World Watch. Of course, we'll be talking with David Curry and all sorts of people in the future as the new list comes out. And of course, we actually focus some time and attention every once in a while on the unreached church and on persecuted Christians and a variety of others. And so we've always come to depend on our good friends at Open Doors and appreciate the long-term and very dedicated ministry that they've had all these years. So thank you for joining us in the program today and look forward to the next opportunity.
Many thanks for allowing us to speak on behalf of the persecuted church. May God bless you.
We're going to take a break and we'll get into some of the issues in the news. This is certainly one of those topics we like to focus some time and attention on, but when we come back, we've got a lot of things happening in Congress right now, as well as in places like Venezuela. And so we really want to cover that from a Christian point of view. So if you'd like to join us in that next hour, open line 1-800-351-1212. If you want to find out some more about some of the things we've covered today, all available at our website, pointofview.net. And so again, I hope you might also consider clicking on that button that says donate to support this ministry. Let me encourage you to support Open Doors. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me this hour. We're going to spend some time talking about the testimony today by the Attorney General William Barr about the special counsel's report, and then we'll also get into the shooting that was at UNC Charlotte, University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and maybe try to understand a little bit more about why this is taking place. Also, Venezuela in the news, and what is happening in Caracas could spell the first step towards freedom for some of the people in Venezuela, or could end up being a way in which Cuba and other communist countries are able to really lock down Venezuela and then spread those communist ideas throughout Latin America. So we'll talk about that. A deal supposedly between the president and the leaders of the Democrats in both the House and the Senate, that'd be Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, on infrastructure. And the first two articles that we've posted today, which we'll get to a little bit later, on the issue of anti-Semitism and the New York Times. I've, of course, been talking about this recently. And for those of you watching online, of course, I have this booklet on anti-Semitism, which has become quite the issue in the last couple of weeks and certainly months. But this one by, first of all, Ben Shapiro, the New York Times, Anti-Semitism is Shocking but Not Surprising. And Dennis Prager, Why Most Jews Aren't Bothered by the Times Anti-Semitic Cartoon. So we'll get into some of those a little bit later. Also, some other articles about the various races involving Joe Biden, the FBI investigating a plot by Antifa to buy guns and staged an armed rebellion at the border. What's that all about? And then I might also come back while we're talking about guns to talk about some of the troubles the National Rifle Association is facing. So we've got a lot to cover this hour. But at any point, if I say something you would like to agree with or disagree with, or like to share some comments, 1-800-351-1212. We have made a point around the program here not spending too much time on the Attorney General or even on the special counsel report. It was a 22-month-long investigation, which at the end concluded that there was no collusion. I believe that Robert Mueller probably knew that going in, so instead chose to focus on those individuals who maybe deserve to be prosecuted, but having nothing to do with the issue of Russian collusion. But there has been kind of a back and forth between Robert Mueller and the Attorney General William Barr, as illustrated by the fact that there was a letter that was released just recently by Robert Mueller just before the testimony today by the Attorney General, which I think was an attempt to kind of sully his investigation. But again, the letter acknowledges what I suspect probably was happening behind the scenes, and that is the special counsel, Robert Mueller, twice pushed the Attorney General to release more of the team's investigative findings back in late March, and that there was, they felt, a gap between the 4-page summary by the Attorney General William Barr and the full report. My argument since the very beginning has been that we need to release the report, and the way to have come to that conclusion was to turn it around. As I've said before, if you had a Democrat president who had a Democratic appointed Attorney General, and after this investigation of the Democrat, the Attorney General released a 4-page summary, I think there'd be a lot of people on the Republican side that would want to say, wait a minute, we want to see the whole report. So that's exactly what has happened. And indeed, William Barr did release the whole report. And of course, there's still been criticism because some of it was redacted, but it had to be redacted. Some of these are ongoing investigations. That simply can't take place. And if I'm going to use the illustration to its extent, imagine after maybe you did have an investigation of a Democrat president, you did have a full releasing of the report, except for that which was redacted. Then if you then had Republicans calling in the Attorney General to criticize him for something you did and did not do, I think most Americans would say, come on, I think enough is enough. And that's what I think most Americans, if they're paying attention to this, are going to say. And that is, we've had 22 months of investigation, a 448-page report. Before that, we had a 4-page summary, which pretty much is as accurate as most people would think in terms of the summary. And all of this has to do with, well, some of these various questions that were raised by Robert Mueller, maybe those could constitute obstruction of justice. I think of context is everything, but nevertheless, that's where we find ourselves with today in terms of some of the back and forth between those on the Senate panel and the Attorney General. We'll see where that goes, but I want to move on because, as we've said before, even though there may be some there, it turns out there wasn't a lot of there, and that's why I think it's worth mentioning a few other issues. But if you'd like to join on that comment or any other comment, I'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. But let's move to our friends in North Carolina right now. University of North Carolina, Charlotte. This former student opened fire in a classroom building on the campus on what essentially was the last day of classes before final exams. He's a former student. He has been disarmed and apprehended. And this is, of course, just another sad example of this. As I mentioned at the outset, but let me mention again, normally on a Wednesday we do our Millennial Round Table, but we will now be moving that because of some of the schedule needs for Nick Pitts. So the Millennial Round Table will now meet on Tuesdays, and the first one will be next Tuesday, May 7th. But Nick Pitts, when he covered this today in his daily briefing, also cites a very good argument that, interestingly enough, I want to try to couch in the fact that the argument that comes down from some of the research that comes primarily from James Allen Fox, who is a professor of criminology, law, and public policy at Northeastern University, is that really schools are safer than they were in the 1990s. Now, I don't want to be cavalier about this because when you have a shooting, a lot of emotions are raw, and any death is certainly a tragedy. But this particular study that came out, interestingly enough, during the time in which there had been the shooting in Parkland, Florida, the shooting at Stoneman Douglas High School, concluded that there have been a number of victim shootings, but the conclusion was kind of striking because they found that shooting incidents involving students have declined since the 1990s. Professor Fox put it this way: 4 times the number of children were killed in schools in the early 1990s than in today. And he said this is not an epidemic of school shootings. Now, again, I'll be the first to admit that any death is tragic. But if you really want to understand the general trajectory, and this has some incredible graphs in it to show that even though every time there is a shooting, there's a lot of publicity, we have, I think the estimates are, I think it's in here somewhere, 55 million school children. When you talk about the very few individuals that have lost their lives, any loss of life is tragic. But it illustrates again that this idea that some young people have that before they graduate, there will probably be a shooting in their school is not true at all. So I want to come back and take some phone calls, first of all, because some of you want to get into the issue of the Mueller investigation and the Attorney General. But then I want to also maybe see if we can answer some questions. Why those shootings in the first place? I think there's some pretty good arguments, and we'll talk about those right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The Attorney General, William Barr, caused quite a stir the other day when he concluded the government had been engaged in spying. The sentence that generated the outrage was this: "I believe the government spied on the Trump campaign." His statement led to another round of commentators arguing that this was merely surveillance, not spying. But in a recent article in The Hill, Kevin Brock explains that even attempting to make a semantic difference misses what was done. He should know, since he was the former Assistant Director of Intelligence for the FBI and served as an FBI Special Agent for 24 years and was the Principal Deputy Director of the National Counterterrorism Center. He explains that what was unleashed on an American citizen was without precedent. The FISA surveillance allows the clandestine microphone and camera capture of the target at all times in all places, even the most intimate of his daily life. It is more intrusive than even a Title III criminal wiretap for a drug dealer or a mob boss. There really is a major difference between spying and FISA court-ordered surveillance. He says it is the epitome of government power over an individual's privacy. It is the nuclear option in the world of intelligence collection. He also reminds us that the government only uses such an option when surveilling foreign nationals who have been spying on U.S. interest, or sometimes for U.S. citizens who hold security clearances and possess national security information that might be turned over to another country. It has never been used by an FBI director or deputy director to intercept an individual with no clearance or obvious access to sensitive information. Please remember this the next time you hear someone reject the idea that the government was spying on the Trump campaign and suggesting that it was only surveillance. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to some phone calls first, and we'll go to Georgia, WPWB. Jeannie, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
You're welcome. Thank you for the great news that you give us. I was wondering if you had heard, and I heard this today on another radio program, that the Mueller report in total has been available to the Congress in a secure room, and that they are allowed to go in there but not take anything out of the room. So have you heard that report, and that there are only 2 people that have requested to go in and see it at this point in time? There may be others. The 2 people happen to be Republicans.
Yeah, there you go. Isn't that interesting? I have heard that there was a way in which people, if they wanted to see an unredacted report, could do so. I did not know all the parameters there, and even more so, I did not know that the only 2 that wanted to look at that were Republicans. Again, this is a kind of a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing, if I can keep quoting or misquoting Hamlet every time, because this is nothing. There is, to use a different phrase that the former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton used to use, it's a nothing burger, and it just is constantly being used to drum up enthusiasm. Because if you really were convinced that one of those sections was too heavily redacted, you could, as you said, go into the room, look at it, and realize, well, no, there's nothing there either. You can pretty much, I've had a chance to kind of look at some of the pages. There's 448 pages. Believe me, I didn't look at all of them, but I've looked at some of them. You can kind of get the sense of what was being said by Mueller and what wasn't. And the rest of this is just a lot of hue and cry during the fact that it's an election year. So I appreciate you educating us on that. I did not know for sure about that, but I was pretty sure they had made it available to individuals that wanted to see an unredacted copy. And once they see it, I think they're going to see that there's really nothing there.
Much ado about it.
That's what I say. Jeannie, thank you for calling today, and we will take some more calls on Mueller, but I think some of you are going to want to talk about this for just a minute. Especially I want to hear from some of you in North Carolina, because you probably have faced this more this last 24-hour news cycle than anyone else because of the shooting in North Carolina. And what I thought was so intriguing is that there haven't been as many news stories about that, in part because it's not like the shooting in Stoneman Douglas High School, which left 17 killed, 14 wounded, and really was kind of the drumbeat for gun control. But nevertheless, I think because there was, sadly, a lower death count, and because there was just such a focus on all sorts of other issues, like the testimony today by the Attorney General, it didn't get so much attention. But let me, before I move on to another topic, address this issue again. We sort of talked about it yesterday when we talked about the shooting at the synagogue near San Diego, or even looking to the other shooting in a synagogue in Pittsburgh. Not to mention, of course, even some of the other shootings. We think of the Muslim mosque in New Zealand and other places. And I mentioned yesterday, but I want to go into it in a little more detail. And if you'd like to read it, my commentary that came out on June 7th of last year talks about Malcolm Gladwell. Now, a lot of us have appreciated his writings over the years, probably best known for a lot of books, Outliers being one of those. But he's argued, based upon information he's been able to collect from other sociologists, that these shootings are what could be called a slow motion riot. And that is, Malcolm Gladwell, first of all, argues that we should not look at these shootings in isolation, but we should see them as connected. That's point number one. Point number two, he says we should understand that the Columbine shooting, that was Harris and Klebold, set a cultural script. And I'll get more into that in just a minute. And then third, we need to understand how each action lowers the next threshold. Let me take the third one first. And that is, if you've ever watched a riot, maybe you've never been in a riot. I've seen some somewhat closer than the rest of us, but I think all of us have seen them on television. You know what happens. The first person to throw a rock through the window lowers the threshold for someone else who may not have thrown a rock initially, but now will do so because the first rock is thrown. And that is, you could go around and say, who's going to throw the first rock? Well, as soon as one rock flies through the window, all of a sudden then garbage cans and other rocks start flying through the window. Some of those individuals would never think about robbing a store, but the moment somebody walks out of that store with something that they've taken during that riot, a lot of others feel like they have the permission, if you will, to do so. And so this is, I think, a good example of where each particular action lowers the threshold for the next individual. And that kind of brings us back to the issue of Columbine, because Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, he says, set the cultural script. They had a website, they made movies, they spelled out their motivations, and that, in some respects, made it easier for other potential shooters to follow their lead. Matter of fact, one study found that a majority of the school shooters 8 years after Columbine, which, by the way, took place 20 years ago, made explicit references to Harris and Klebold. And they even found, in this study, even more amazing, a majority of school shootings outside of the United States also were versions of Columbine. So what we're seeing is, in some respects, maybe a slow motion riot taking place. Which brings us to an article that I posted yesterday. If you would like to find it, all you have to do is go to pointofview.net. On the site navigation, go to shows, and then you just go to yesterday's show, and you'll find the article. It's written by Jim Garrity. It's entitled, Are Angry Violent Young Men? And I used it yesterday primarily to talk about the synagogue shooting, but it's even more applicable to the one we're talking about here today. And that is, he has all sorts of studies, but I'll just cite three of them in the interest of time. The first was a study that found that almost 60% of the mass shooters had been diagnosed with a mental disorder or exhibited maybe some sign of serious mental illness. But what about the other 40% whose actions could not be attributed in any way to mental illness? Moreover, he talks about the fact that there's always this focus on these troubled young men, which leads to a second study that he quotes, which is pretty intriguing, in which they found that communities that have experienced these mass shootings are more or less middle class. Oftentimes, they're fairly affluent. The mean household income in some of these were $65,000, according to one study there. And what they found oftentimes is many of these communities that had a mass shooting actually have both high income and high inequality, which leads me to the third study, which I'll mention just before we take our break. And that is a study of 39 of the school shooters felt that half were maybe bullied or sought some kind of refuge or revenge. And so there were certainly there. Also, some had expressed thoughts of suicide, and many of them had easy access to guns. So, which means maybe family members had them. But I think Jim Garrity makes a really good point. Bullying, thoughts of suicide, even the existence of firearms have always existed for a long time. But something, he says, in the 2 decades since the Columbine shooting has spurred troubled young people to believe that the best way to deal with their problems is to deal with this by killing other people they don't know, by murdering as many strangers as possible. So I want to take a break, but I'd love to get your comments because it, to me, shows these aren't necessarily always troubled youth, but are individuals that sometimes believe that the way in which to gain notoriety or to get back is to go out and kill people they don't even know, because that's really what's taking place here. Now, again, we have to keep in mind that in some respects the school shootings have actually declined, but you wouldn't know that by the way the press has covered it. But whether there's one or dozens is immaterial. The point is there are some things that are causing these angry, violent young men to act out. And certainly violent video games come to mind. Certainly some of the sense of suicide and despair in our world come to mind. And, of course, some people say the ready access to guns, although, as I have said so many times, and I always get criticized every time I bring it up on an interview, but I'll bring it up again. We probably had more guns in schools back in the 1950s and 60s than we have today. We used to have rifle clubs. Young people would bring guns to the schools. They theoretically were unloaded, but I know enough about teenagers to know some probably forgot to unload the gun. Didn't have the school shootings then, so if it's the guns, I think it's more the hands that held the guns. But I'd love to get your thoughts. 1-800-351-1212. I also want to come back after we've taken some phone calls on this and talk about what's happening in Venezuela and maybe even whether or not we have a deal to actually begin to rebuild the infrastructure of the United States. That was a campaign promise of President Donald Trump. So we'll see. And we have a lot to cover, but if you'd like to join our conversation, have a comment, pro or con, love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. We'll take some calls and be back right after this.
Question: do you have a health insurance plan you are not happy with? Well, Bethany and Jason thought they were stuck. Their plan just kept getting more expensive, and Bethany's favorite doctor didn't even take that plan anymore. And then some friends at church told them about MediShare.
With our previous insurance, we were paying $1,200 a month. With MediShare, we now pay around $600 a month.
Yes, they're paying $600 less per month, and that's a pretty typical savings with MediShare. And they actually like MediShare more.
I was able to go back to my original doctor that I absolutely loved, and it's just been an absolutely beautiful thing being a part of MediShare.
Yeah, so they pay a lot less and they like it more. No wonder MediShare is growing so fast. Find out more. They're super easy to talk to. All you have to do is call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Looked on the screen there, and I saw Macbeth, and I thought, oh, did I? Yeah, probably said Hamlet, and I wanted to clarify that. Sound and fury signifying nothing. Don't want my English teacher coming in here and slapping both hands, so again, I want to get that right. And certainly did misspeak on that, but let's take some phone calls, because if nothing else, you have some comments about this, and I'd like to get your thoughts. So, Jonathan, listening on the Good News Network in Georgia, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Hey, Kirby. Hope you're having a great day.
I am.
I had a question. Good. I had a question for you, and then also had a comment, if that's all right.
Sure.
My question was, I was a little surprised with the statistic on the school shootings. I was wondering if that study was specifically pointing to the events rather than the individuals killed. Sadly killed. Was the individuals killed less, or were the events less, or both?
Good point. And I skipped over some of it because I didn't know if everybody wanted to get into the details. You know, sometimes I try not to nerd out here. But what they did was looking at first two categories: multiple victim shootings, of which at this time, of course, this was done really after the shooting at Stoneman Douglas High School, so you would have to add one more now in North Carolina. But looking at when this was done, they talk about there were 16 multiple victim shootings in schools. That's where you had 4 or more victims and at least 2 deaths by firearms. So that's what you would call a multiple victim shooting, which is different than a mass shooting. And there were 8 mass shootings because that involves 4 or more deaths, and in each one of those cases we're excluding the assailant. So yes, if there's 1 or 2 people shot, they wouldn't be put in the same category as a mass shooting. So you have to recognize that part of it has to do with sort of the academic nature of the way this was put together. And they're pulling data from the FBI's Supplementary Homicide Report, USA Today, Congressional Research Service. So you're right. It is looking at those so-called mass shootings, not every potential incident, which I think is sometimes more accurate, because if you've even heard some of my commentaries in the past, even where they had one that was listed the other day, which I critiqued as a mass shooting, where an individual suffering from PTSD killed himself in the school parking lot, and they call that a mass shooting. Well, no, it's not. I mean, he committed suicide. He happened to do it in a school, but it's not a mass shooting. So if you get the definitions right, then you can see that actually we still have probably one of the safest places in America still in the schools, but you wouldn't know that if you watch the mainstream media every day. I hope that answers your question a little better.
Yeah, because I was thinking that the events might have increased, which I suspect they have, but the numbers of individuals killed has probably decreased with better training and more awareness.
Yeah, you're a smart guy. You figured it out. That's good.
Yeah. But my comment was also related to school shootings. Recently, I finished reading a book. It's called On Killing. It's by Lieutenant Dave Grossman.
Yeah, Dave Grossman's been on the program many times. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, he's a historian, a soldier, and also a psychologist. A really awesome combination, if you ask me. But in his book, he was commenting there towards the end about school shootings and the psychology behind how video games affect our children today and that kind of stuff. And me being a 22-year-old, I was at least at first skeptical of, well, hold on now. I've played a few video games in my life, and I've never been tempted to go shoot anyone, So I was skeptical at first, but he won me over by describing how that desensitizes our minds, the sensory adaptation. You walk into a room with the burned cooking smell, and over time, it fades away. Or I'm going to do something mean and say, your eyes cancel out your nose. And now I say that, and you're going to see your nose for the next 30 minutes. But that applies with the video games are depicting most of the time people shooting people, the man-shaped targets. From the Vietnam era of the bullseye military training, basic to World War II era with the man-shaped target that fell down, and then you were rewarded for marksmanship. So a combination of all that is good, for soldiers, because they're trained also with a superior authority that tells them when to fire and when to not, and that is not at all present with kids playing video games nowadays or anything like that. There's no stop. There's no it's all kill. There's no stop or discipline there. So that was my comment. I'll let you go on.
Well, Jonathan, first of all, I would commend that book because it really does help you understand how the military began to say, we've got to change this from shooting, as he said, bullseye to shooting human targets, because there's something built into us that keeps us from killing another human being. And so they noticed this first in the Civil War. Lots of times they would notice that they would, I won't go into all the details about how you have to ram a bullet down there, but lots of times people, even during Gettysburg, wouldn't fire. They'd pick up these rifles and they had multiple bullets in it because people could just never, it's really hard to kill another human being. You don't realize that. And so even after the Vietnam War, they started saying, we've got to do some things that improve our kill ratios. And that's where Dave Grossman said, really, when I look at these video games, they're like killing machines. They're like teaching people to kill. And so he, first of all, had some testimony in Jonesboro, Arkansas, lived near there when you had these two kind of Opie and Beaver kind of young boys shooting kids, and then actually gave testimony at, West Paducah, Kentucky, where this one individual had hardly ever shot a gun, but when he shot him, it was headshot, headshot, headshot. It's almost like he was just living out his video game experience. And so it's interesting that not only in his book On Killing, but he did a follow-up book with a co-author on Stop Teaching Our Kids to Kill. And, of course, we've mentioned, well, first of all, we had him on a number of times, but we also mentioned him other times when we've talked about school safety evidence that we've done by various guests that have been in studio. So, Jonathan, you've done a good job of doing research. You might also look for the other book by Dave Grossman, because that also gets into the desensitization and the ability to sort of overcome this natural hesitancy we have about killing one another, which I think have been lowered dramatically by the level of visual violence that young people are experiencing today. Let's go to Maine, WSEW. Steve, what's your point of view today?
Hi, Kirby. Thanks for taking my call. So this is a really interesting topic, and I keep on coming back to something that I always kind of find myself coming back to in these types of scenarios and topics, and that is when it comes right down to it, yes, we have all these socio, inputs that we have in our society now, video games that we didn't have, 30 years ago, and people before video games, they were blaming, movies and TV. Would they be blaming books if we didn't have all of that technology?
Yeah. Again, you are the person pulling the triggers responsible, but are there some contributing factors? I think it's reasonable to ask that question sometimes, don't you think?
Yes. And I think ultimately what it does come down to in the end is there's a spiritual war going on, and yes, we need revival in this country, and yes, that's all that's going to fix this.
I would agree. I mean, like I said before, even though not all the kids that went to school in the 1950s that took their rifles and set them in the back of the room and never shot anybody were all Christians, but they were at least living in a kind of a Christianized culture, or the memories of Christianity, the idea that everyone's created in the image of God, everybody has value. Even if there was discrimination during that time and everything else, still there was sort of this respect for human life. And until we get back to that, and I think the ultimate answer to the question we're putting on the table here, Steve, is a revival and a reformation. Because apart from that, we can talk about gun control and we can talk about all sorts of ways to protect the schools, but it's what's in the heart of individuals. So I think you're right on target.
Amen. Thank you, Kirby.
I'm unfortunately coming to a break, so I'll have to take this next call after the break. If you want to hang out there, we will do so. And let me just mention that we may run out of time to talk about some of these other issues, but when we come back from the break, I'll try to take another call. Do want to talk about a little bit of what's going on in Venezuela, because I think that's at least a matter of prayer, because you have right now the Democratic leaders, sort of those following Juan Guaido, trying to revolt against the Cuban-backed dictator Nicolas Maduro. So maybe we'll talk about that briefly. And if we don't get to all these issues, good news is we have more to cover tomorrow, which we will do so here on Point of View. For those of you, again, normally expecting on a Wednesday to have a Millennial Round Table, don't forget we're moving that to Tuesday from now on. So next Tuesday, May 7th, Nick Pitts will be sitting in this chair. But we'll come back and take some more phone calls right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The whitewashed churches of New England, often contrasted against the reds and yellows of fall foliage, have captured the imagination of painters and photographers everywhere, but not the Supreme Court of the United States. In March of 2019, the justices declined to review an appeal from a New Jersey Supreme Court decision that declared the funding of grants for the historic preservation of these historic church buildings unconstitutional. Such grants allowed local organizations to repair things like shingles, paint, or mechanical work, but not hymn books, altarpieces, or Sunday school lessons. At least a few justices viewed the denial of these funds to churches as religious discrimination. A perplexed and unequivocal Justice Brett Kavanaugh, writing for Justices Alito and Gorsuch, said in a statement, "Barring religious organizations because they are religious from a general historic preservation grants program is pure discrimination against religion." Indeed, it is difficult to conceive of a more unvarnished religious discrimination. The government deciding that religious organizations are ineligible to participate equally in the public square merely because they are religious is precisely the type of religious discrimination the founders were trying to prevent. Justice Kavanaugh is absolutely right in declaring this to be pure discrimination against religion. No state official should discriminate against people of faith or the religious organizations they operate, based merely on their religious status. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just mention as a program note that tomorrow we're going to have Paul Kenger in studio. For those of you watching online here, this, by the way, you might want to read it ahead of time, appeared in the American Spectator, Cultural Marxism and Its Conspirators. And you know we've occasionally mentioned cultural Marxism, and it's been quite some time since we've actually got into this particular topic. So we're going to kind of convene class tomorrow in the first hour, hear from Paul Kenger, and really get into this in some detail, because there is a lot of confusion about what cultural Marxism is and is not. And here's a program note as well. There's some people that are actually Marxists on universities that are trying to actually obscure what is actually taking place. So we're going to really try to blow the lid out on that. So I would encourage you to listen tomorrow, but also you might want to go to the American Spectator. This piece came out a while ago. It's been a while before we got him on, but still, it's a great piece that we are going to spend some time talking about. Gary Chapman will be with us the next hour. We'll talk about some things that'll help your family. So as always, we cover lots of different issues, but I just thought I would mention that. Don't forget that, of course, Friday is our weekend edition, and Kelly Shackelford will be back with us, and we'll have Keisha Russell, and we will cover lots of these stories as well. Let's go just one more phone call before I get into some other issues to Georgia. And Steve, what would you like to share with us today?
Well, I just wanted to reiterate what Jonathan had said earlier. You know, I believe the video games have a lot to do with these school shootings and so forth, but I don't know that they're studying that. They sure don't report on that. And also the fact that there's such lack of discipline with children anymore. You can't discipline a child anymore, so they're just pretty much free to do what they want to do.
Well, I think those are two key points. First of all, let's give credit where credit was due. Jonathan was talking about Dave Grossman, his book, Stop Teaching Our Kids to Kill. There have been a few studies looking at links between video games and subsequent violence. Now, again, even the studies that have been done by the Surgeon Generals of the United States, and there have been 3 different studies that have all demonstrated the visual violence. So sometimes they looked at violence on television, violence in video games. They always have some weasel words there because they want to say, as Jonathan was pointing out, just because you watch video games or play even violent video games, Call of Duty or whatever it is, doesn't mean you're going to go out and be the next shooter. But it does point out that those individuals who might be already susceptible, already have some kind of mental issue, as we talked about, or some kind of emotional deficit, they're more vulnerable. So it doesn't mean that if your kids play video games that they're going to be out there shooting somebody. But it also means that a responsible parent should really pay attention to what is coming in the ear gate and the eye gate. I think that is really appropriate. Steve, the other point that you make is a good one, too. When there's no discipline, when you can get away with anything, it, again, lowers that threshold. You know, like I said, if you think of this like a riot, maybe some kids aren't going to throw a rock through the window, but if one kid throws a rock through the window and there are no repercussions, other kids are going to throw rocks through the window. And so you can see where both of the points you've talked about could be contributing factors. So I really appreciate you bringing them up.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wish we had a little more time, but I do want to cover at least one other or 2 other topics real quickly, and those are issues that we maybe will come back to tomorrow. I did mention what's going on in Venezuela, and I think this is certainly a matter of prayer because, again, just in case you're not familiar, the individual that's in power right now, Nicolas Maduro, has been backed by the Cubans, and this is of concern. And so as a result, Juan Guaido has actually encouraged some of his allies to go and protest. Now, here's where you need to exercise some discernment because some of the press have referred to the bringing some of these forces out into the street as a coup, as a political coup. I think, as the Wall Street Journal points out, it's probably better characterized as a popular revolt against an illegitimate ruler. And I love what they say. Either Venezuelans will reclaim their freedom or they will face instability and misery, which will not only develop even more so in Caracas, Venezuela, but will maybe even spread to the other Americas. And so it's kind of a high-risk gamble right now for Juan Guaido, who is the duly elected individual. Because if it fails, I think he'll be targeted for arrest or probably just assassination or execution. But it's also kind of high stakes for the Trump administration because President Trump, I don't disagree with this, but I just want to say President Trump back in January recognized Juan Guaido as the legitimate leader of Venezuela. If you watched television yesterday, you might have seen the U.S. National Security Advisor, that would be John Bolton, who's been on the program with us, by the way, who told reporters outside the White House that, quote, key officials in the regime have been talking to the opposition for 3 months and need to act now. And he specifically mentioned one of those individuals, who is the defense minister, Vladimir Padrino, who is the chief judge of the Supreme Court and the commander of the Presidential Guard. So we'll see where this goes. But if indeed freedom comes to those in Venezuela, maybe they could move away from this socialist disaster. And again, one of the best arguments against socialism is to look at what happened in Venezuela. It was actually brought in by an election. This was not some kind of military takeover. People actually did elect Hugo Chavez, but this disaster is unfolding right before our very eyes. But one other issue I thought I'd mention, and this one affects you and your family even more so, is the decision that seems to be reached between the president and the 2 Democrat leaders, that would be Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, on the whole issue of infrastructure. I love what the Wall Street Journal said here. Who says bipartisanship in Washington is dead? Well, Democrats in Congress visited the White House on Tuesday, and they emerged to say that they and President Trump have agreed to spend $2 trillion on public works. When it comes to spending more money, Washington can always find common ground. But, of course, they asked the question, when we have a federal budget deficit that's already $1 trillion, how are we going to spend an additional $2 trillion? And where is that money coming from? As a matter of fact, we have House Democrats couldn't even pass a budget because some of the progressives there wanted to spend an additional $67 billion on domestic spending. And oh, by the way, Republicans wanted to spend more on defense. And that's all before you even talk about this infrastructure blowout. Gary Bauer's been on the program with us before, says that everyone knows we need more and better roads, bridges, and airports for the United States. Construction jobs created by these projects could employ tens of thousands of middle-class workers. But Schumer and Pelosi want all sorts of deals. They want to, for example, get tax hikes and actually have the president address the issue of climate change, which are going to be just deal killers for sure, because they've said they won't raise the gasoline tax, which I don't think we should anyway, but only if President Trump rolls back some of the 2017 tax cuts. And also, of course, a lot of people pointed out that, as even the Wall Street Journal said, rest assured that when they talk about infrastructure there, they don't just mean roads and bridges. They mean trying to find ways, like happened last time with the stimulus package, of putting money in the pockets of various union groups as well. So we'll pay attention to that one. But it is your money, and at a time when we have $21 trillion in national debt, we want to spend an additional $2 trillion on infrastructure, when a lot of it won't even go to building roads and airports and other things. We need to reevaluate some of that. But tomorrow we're going to talk some time about cultural Marxism, and this will be a chance for you to learn a little bit more about an issue that we do talk about from time to time here on Point of View. Then we'll talk with Gary Chapman about some things you can do to strengthen your marriage and family. In between, we'll get into some more issues in the news. We'll have a lot to cover then. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. See you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
It's amazing but true. When it comes to one of America's biggest household expenditures, healthcare, a lot of people think they've got no choice. People are used to thinking we have to do it this way, but they don't. Yes, you have the freedom to choose an alternative with your healthcare. It's MediShare, and it costs way less than the alternatives. The typical family saves $500 a month, not a year, a month. And if you're single, this can save you a lot too. And let's face it, a big reason MediShare is 400,000 people strong, it just works. They've shared over $3 billion in medical bills, so they can help share your needs too. Joining MediShare for so many people is one of those things that makes you say, why didn't I do this before? So yes, the time has come for something better. Look into joining MediShare and see why so many people are opting out of the old way and into the new. Why not look into this? Just call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.